America has a complicated history. Over the last several centuries, it's seen colonization, independence, enslavement, 27 flag iterations, and a growing population of people watching it all happen. Despite the constant shifts over the last 2.5 centuries, a few things have remained constants in society, one being the press. Soon after independence, it was the early newspapers, like the Gazette of the United States, that delivered the news from the 13 colonies to a population of just 4 million. This was the only way Americans got their news for 150 years, until the late 1920s, at which point a majority of Americans got their news from radio. That held true until the late 1950s, when about 90% of Americans got television, which delivered for another 40-odd years until the 2000s, when most Americans began consuming their news digitally. Even though news looks very different today than it did back when Thomas Jefferson was making headlines, the fact has remained that everyone has to find out somehow. While news has changed incrementally over the last 2.5 centuries, a rapid shift is happening in media today, one of polarization.
Wait a second. Of course he said rapist. He used the very word rapist, Judge. You don't want to hear it.
Can you answer my question? Why are you refusing to answer my question?
I'm conducting the interview with all due respect.
What I said is the Grand Wizards of the KKK would be proud of what they would hear her say.
You didn't just say they would be proud.
To see them come out immediately, horns locked immediately, kill, unrelentingly. Like they clearly hate each other.
Proud. He cooperated with them.
No, he didn't. That's how
he cooperated with them.
Yelling it doesn't make it true.
Yeah, it does.
Now they want us wearing an N95 where you can't breathe and ends up with dents on your face. We want to do that for the rest of our lives?
This may be the most reckless and destructive thing any American president has ever done to the United States.
Politics, and news as a result, have become increasingly extreme in the last several years, to the point where half of the country hears one thing and the other half hears another. This divide threatens one of the things we value most: our freedom to live in a dignified, civil society. Black Americans, who make up roughly 12% of the US population, have had a complicated and unjust history in the United States. Starting back in enslavement centuries ago, Black Americans had their freedom, rights, and dignity taken away, and later through the imposition of Jim Crow laws, and the effects are undeniable. To this day, the battle still rages on against racism and discrimination in society, and in the media. 2/3 of Black Americans believe media coverage of the Black population is more unfavorable than that of other races, and 40% say they see coverage extremely often that they view as racist or racially insensitive. That's where we are, with prejudice, racism, and discrimination continuing to be pervasive and impacting the way stories are reported on in our society. One of those stories was about a man named Ahmaud Arbery.
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 Ahmaud Arbery was a 25-year-old Black man with a passion for running, who tragically became the focal point of conversations around racial discourse in America. He was a star athlete in high school, and he often jogged through a neighborhood near his home in Brunswick, Georgia, just 80 miles south of Savannah. One day in early 2020, he was jogging through the neighborhood of Satilla Shores, like he often did, and he was pursued by 3 armed white men who, after a physical altercation, shot him. They have since been found guilty and sentenced to life in prison, but this incident emerged in the period defined by Black Lives Matter protests and the murders of innocent Black Americans like George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. This came after a string of break-ins in the neighborhood by a Black man allegedly with a similar appearance to Arbery's, but there's no evidence to suggest it was him. Arbery's aunt, Diane Jackson, told me that to move on as a family, the media can't keep questioning the circumstance of this incident.
It hurts. It really hurts. And then they take stuff the wrong way and they run with it. And then you have to hear stuff like this and you know he wasn't that type of person. It hurts that people can stop judging people and know people for themselves before they start putting stuff out there.
This case was immediately picked up by the small-town newspaper in Brunswick. Reporter Larry Hobbs, who was the first to report on the story, told me that the day he found out about this, he immediately realized this story was complicated and would take a long time to unravel.
No information was coming out on this at first, but what I knew by like 3 o'clock that afternoon, I got something out immediately. It was only 3 or 4 sentences, but I got everything out there. A lot of it was just police would not say further. And usually, frankly, the Glenn County police say more than they were saying about this. Why is a young Black man dead in the middle of the street. What they would tell me that this started as a particular burglary incident. Okay, so why is a burglary suspect dead in the middle of the street? And that needed to be answered. And frankly, the answers didn't come for quite a while. But you wouldn't even know about this if I hadn't been covering it. Literally, nobody covered this but me and the Brunswick News for about 6 weeks.
Hobbs was written about in national news for his role in letting the country know of Arbery's murder, and he won the McCommons Award for Distinguished Community Journalism from the University of Georgia for his coverage. The fact that it took so long to receive adequate information about this case alone doesn't represent bias in the media, but that this story wasn't picked up nationally for so many weeks says a lot about the depiction of violent incidents against Black Americans. That is just another one, something that Hobbs quickly realized wasn't the case.
This is why we do what we do, because this could turn out to be, and I hate to say just another killing, but they happen even in a small community like this about 4 or 5 times a year, and there's usually an explanation. This one didn't seem like it had an explanation from the start, but I mean, this thing started unraveling like a Hollywood script. And I had people telling me, people in positions of authority telling me, this isn't what you think it is, Larry.
In the aftermath of Arbery's murder, some in the region's local media reported on him in an unfavorable light, suggesting that the men who pursued him were trying to protect their community, perform a citizen's arrest, or ask him a question, instead of kill an unarmed Black man in an act now adjudicated by federal court as a hate crime. These allegations and portrayals perpetuated harmful stereotypes and undermined efforts by the trial's prosecution to seek justice for Arbery. In the process of investigating this case, I spoke to J.L. Josiah Watts, who told me, quote, the local paper ran stories that portrayed him as a criminal and at fault for everything, and that they had, quote, a narrative that made Ahmaud a criminal before this story would go national. He's the cousin of Ahmaud Arbery and reported the incident to the New York Times. In Atlanta, the story was picked up by reporter Richard Fawcett, who wrote one of the first stories about the case nationally. He told me he thinks that the bias we see in the media today is left over from a time when portrayals of Black Americans were so often negative, and these impacts are still deeply ingrained in the Deep South.
People my age, I'm 54 years old, grew up with just an almost constant barrage of negative images of Black people. I think that there continue to be jarring after effects of these kinds of portrayals. We were in the very deep South. I think if you're white in that part of Georgia, you're just adjacent to a lot of racist thinking. Some of these guys expressed racist sentiments, used racist language. I think all these things kind of come together. It's not just the media piece, but it's also the much more intimate kind of historical, geographical milieu.
The explicit racial bias in the coverage of this case was concerning the fact that Arbery was killed while he was running. Fawcett wrote an article about this in the New York Times and spoke to me a little bit about why a Black man jogging through a white, middle-class neighborhood was even viewed as out of the ordinary to start.
A lot was written about the fact that this young man who was a successful high school athlete was out running. And this reality that a Black man running for some people carries a different connotation than a white person running. And this very sort of insidious idea that the Black person must be running from something. This is part of the sort of insidious, racial piece of this, what should be this very, non-problematic, exercise.
There's a sardonic term, running while Black, which references the racial profiling that Black runners experience. Like Fawcett said, for some, a Black person running carries a different connotation than a white person running. This term originates from Sonia Sanchez's 1986 play, The Bronx is Next, where a white officer arrests a Black man for running while Black. Since then, the term has been used in coverage of incidents like the 2015 death of Freddie Gray in Baltimore, when he was arrested for possession of a knife and died in police custody while he was running. Also in 2015, the arrest of professional sprinter Jimmy Thrunka in London while running. And, of course, the murder of Ahmaud Arbery while he was just running. The issue of the portrayal of Black Americans in the media is complicated, wide-ranging, and hard to solve. But to try and counter some of the issues those I've talked to have brought up, there are a few steps we can take in different areas. The first is the diversification of media ownership and management to help limit concentrations of power by race. This can happen in a variety of ways, like identifying Black-run news establishments and helping them to gain visibility and reach. Another way is ensuring that those who are interested in careers are provided with sufficient opportunities to succeed, no matter their race. Finally, encouraging large media outlets to diversify staff to portray the entire range of experiences happening, not just one. The second is the improvement of representation in media content. Hiring Black journalists, writers, researchers, bookers, and producers can create a wider range of representations in the media. Also, encouraging media outlets to examine their coverage for biases or stereotypes can promote balanced representation. The final area is education in media literacy. This is important not just in the area of racial bias, but across the board in the news today. Knowing what is a trusted source and what isn't can help us immensely to recognize and challenge harmful stereotypes, and possibly most importantly, to talk about this stuff. In grade school and post-secondary, it's important now to learn about digital citizenship and media literacy and how to think critically about the news we consume. In the age of social media, when anyone can post anything, it's essential to have the skills needed to look further into what we see. We've tried in the past and will try again in the future to solve the problems facing our global community, but by taking the right steps, we can move towards ensuring an equitable future for all in our society.
I want to tell you a story. You probably saw how many people were outside the courthouse every day, thousands, and especially for the verdict. And I had already written my story the night before. I had it in my heart what that verdict was going to be. My first three sentences were guilty, guilty, guilty. Ahmaud Arbery was the first Black mayor of the city of Brunswick. He and I would talk outside, during recesses in court and during lunch recess and things like that. And I saw him outside after the verdict, after I'd come out of there, and we hugged each other and shook hands. And he said, "Larry, we showed the world, we showed America that you can get justice in a small southern town." And I was so happy. I was like, yeah, don't you know? And don't you know how proud I am because of my legacy, of my demographic, to see this happen. Hopefully it's not happened for once. Moving forward, this is the way things go.